And I'd also like to thank you and Erik for so kindly inviting me to participate in this lecture series of the Phenomenology of Dementia and Aging Network. I'm really honored to be included in such an esteemed lineup of speakers. I'm excited to share with your network some research that I've been doing that brings together my long-standing interests in embodiment and dementia, and my more recent interests in citizenship, human rights, and the arts. My hope is that by the end of my presentation, critical links between these topics will be clear, as well as the ethical implications of these links. Indeed, the theory that I've long been passionate about has important implications in the real world. And so this link between theory and practice is extremely important for the culture change work that I'm committed to. So by way of context, in all of my work, I'm motivated by a very deep concern about stigma surrounding dementia and how it promotes social exclusion, deprives people with dementia of their dignity, and mitigates their participation in social life. This can have detrimental consequences for quality of life and quality of care, and undermine the rights of persons living with dementia. I'm committed to critiquing this stigma and to fostering an alternative and more quality-enhancing vision of care and support that promotes inclusion, relationality, creativity, and the possibility of growth for everyone living with and who are impacted by dementia. I'd like to begin with some discussion about stigma associated with dementia, the discourses that are contributing to this stigma, and links between stigma and discriminatory practices, particularly in how the arts are reduced to a therapeutic tool to manage challenging behaviors. I'll then introduce a relational model of citizenship that I'll argue has enormous potential to contribute to the theoretical and empirical rethinking of creativity in the context of dementia, and to more fully supporting people to live well with dementia. Findings from 2 research studies will be discussed to illustrate how the relational model of citizenship brings a new and critical dimension to understanding the creativity of persons living with dementia, while also addressing broader issues of their inclusivity and the ethical imperative to fully support engagement with the arts through institutional policies, structures, and practices. And I'll conclude with some thoughts about the implications of this analysis for practice. The analysis presented here is based on a couple of publications that I have co-authored with colleagues. So this is definitely not work that I've done on my own. These are the citations for those publications, and I would be happy to share these with anybody that's interested. Persons living with dementia are highly stigmatized in society. Stigma associated with dementia creates social exclusion and public health inequality by depriving persons living with dementia of their human rights and threatening their health, well-being, and quality of life. Stigma is a complex social process that's used to describe the stereotypes, prejudices, and discriminatory practices that are based on a socially discredited attribute, such as a diagnostic label like dementia. Stigma has multiple negative health and social consequences for individuals living with dementia. There's considerable evidence that receiving a dementia diagnosis confers a master status to the individual, whereby persons with dementia come to be defined solely through their disease and the stigma that it engenders. It thus allocates the person to a lower social status and results in their social dislocation and marginalization. Self-internalization of stigma associated with dementia has been linked to avoidance of social interactions, isolation, feelings of shame and inadequacy, depression, anxiety, and even suicide. Stigma is a barrier to help seeking, and in instances where help is sought, stigmatizing attitudes of formal care providers creates obstacles to timely diagnosis and delay access to therapeutic treatment. Stigma associated with dementia is largely based on the cultural imaginary or collective representation of persons with dementia as incapable of purposeful and meaningful communication and the pursuit of life-enhancing relationships and activities. The assumption is that the neuropathology that's associated with dementia eradicates the essence of the person. This is evident in the metaphors and images in policy and popular culture that represent dementia as the funeral without end, the loss of self, the zombie, and a living death. This discourse has its roots in the rise of the modern self in the 17th century, the rise of the modern self in the 17th century, and the socially constructed brain self consubstantiality. As Fernando Vidal has argued, this ideology of the self, the individualism characteristic of Western and Westernized societies, the supreme value given to the individual as autonomous agent of choice and initiative, and the corresponding emphasis on interiority, treats the brain as the organ responsible for the functions with which the self is identified. When the self is assumed lost or eroded, loss of agency and citizenship statutes ensues. Assumptions of loss of self dehumanize and demarcate the lives of people living with dementia as disposable, and enable and legitimize discriminatory practices such as leaving residents in soiled diapers, being left for hours at a time without any meaningful engagement with others, or having opportunity to pursue meaningful activities, and restrictions on the freedom of individuals living with dementia. Restraints of all kinds, physical, chemical, environmental, are an obvious example of such restrictions. But the reduction of the arts to a non-pharmacological treatment or therapy to achieve medicalized outcomes, most notably the management of misunderstood behaviors, is another example of restrictions on the freedom of individuals living with dementia that I wish to focus on here. Arts-based programs have been adopted in dementia care primarily as a non-pharmacological means to improve behavior, cognition, and emotional states. While these clinical outcomes are most commonly reported when assessing the impact of arts engagement on persons living with dementia, other benefits of engaging in artistic activities have been identified, including empowerment, meaningful self-expression, and sociability. However, these are typically considered side benefits and not the primary reason for implementing arts programs. The instrumental use of the arts to generate social and behavioral changes has now become a cornerstone of dementia care. Dominant assumptions to understanding creative engagement, particularly in music and dance, in the context of life with dementia, have focused on cortical structures and neural substrates as the generative mechanism for such creativity. The implicit assumption is that creativity is based on cognitive abilities and processes, most notably a working cognitive memory. Understandings of creativity implicit in these accounts derive from a presumed dichotomy between mind and body and an inherent inferiority of bodily constituted knowledge. Thus, the body as a source of agency has largely been neglected in accounts of music and dance and creativity more generally. So we argue that understanding creativity of persons living with dementia requires engagement with critical gerontology's subfield of embodiment and dementia. We further argue that to ensure that creativity is supported beyond therapeutics requires engagement with the fields of citizenship and human rights, as these fields focus on social entitlements and state responsibility to support and acknowledge citizens' participation in their own everyday existence. Insights from all of these respective fields have been integrated in a model of relational citizenship. I developed this model with Dr. Grigorovich, who's an assistant professor at Brock University in Ontario, Canada, a human rights lawyer, Mr. Alexis Kontos, who works for the Department of Justice in Ontario, Canada, and he is also my brother, and a sociologist, Dr. Karen Lee Miller, who does policy work for the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care in Ontario. Person-centered and relationship-centered paradigms of care have undoubtedly been influential developments in the field, in the dementia field, since the 1990s. While these paradigms of care importantly underscore the intrinsic value of persons living with dementia and the interdependent and reciprocal nature of care relationships, there has been a recent turn to citizenship discourse to more fully account for issues of power differentials within the triadic care relationship and with the state. Citizenship is a legal status based on nationality that's conferred by a state at birth or through naturalization, which also confers specific rights and duties, including civil, political, and social rights. It's a status bestowed on those who are full members of a community, and thus discussion of citizenship introduces political discourse, in that participation or inclusion in society is inevitably shaped by power dynamics. As proponents of citizenship discourse have argued, a citizenship perspective critically draws attention to power, and in particular, the lack of power afforded to some citizens in relation to others. The importance of such a focus for the dementia field is that power has not been sufficiently treated in person-centered and relationship-centered care paradigms. Citizenship extends relationship-centered care by incorporating an individual's relations with others into the socio-political landscape, thereby addressing influences on access to and experience with health and social care institutions. An active model of citizenship was initially adopted in the field of dementia, granting citizenship rights to individuals with dementia who had previously been excluded from the broader service user movement because they were seen as antithetical to the notion of a proactive, rational consumer of services. Campaigning activities repositioned individuals with mild dementia as citizen workers, which yielded social and psychological benefits associated with activism, self-advocacy, and the companionship of others with similar impairments. Nonetheless, this model of citizenship is premised on the ideological construct of self-cognizance, which deepens the social devaluation of those with more severe cognitive impairment, who may not be able to make recognizable public contributions. There have been important developments in the sociological field that have effectively broadened what counts as citizenship, such as the passive model of citizenship that's concerned with people getting what they're entitled to or have a right to expect as an equal citizen without having to make a public contribution. With this corrective to the ethical principle of no rights without responsibilities, citizenship is defined not by degree of participation, but rather by the degree to which an individual's rights are recognized and upheld through care practices, policies, and institutions. Yet there's a concerning absence in these developments of attention to the body as a source of agency and body-world relations. Without consideration of embodied intentionality, which in the context of severe and persisting cognitive impairment is the primary means of engagement, such approaches to citizenship fall short of being fully inclusive. This suggests the need for citizenship discourse to engage with critical insights of scholarship on dementia and embodiment. Building on embodied selfhood, the relational model of citizenship underscores that primordial and sociocultural dispositions of the body are sources of self-expression and relationality. Embodied selfhood takes its theoretical bearings from Merleau-Ponty's reconceptualization of perception and Bourdieu's concept of habitus. This advances the notion of selfhood that considers both the pre-reflective intentionality of the body and its natural engagement with the world, as well as the ongoing sociocultural relationship between the pre-reflective body and the world. Together, these theoretical bearings capture the pre-reflective capacity of the body to seize upon and transform the perceptible into something meaningful. The body here is intentional in its capacity to perceive and experience. This importantly challenges assumptions of loss of agency with dementia by treating the body as itself having creative and intentional capacity. Thus, even in the face of cognitive impairment, agency persists. In the encounter between the body and the social world, Sociocultural dispositions do not suppress the body's power of natural expression, but in fact constantly utilize the pre-reflective, practical, and implicit hold that individuals living with dementia have on their body and the relation between their body and the world. Although postures, gestures, and movements of the body disclose a sociocultural particularity that is shaped by socialization associated with membership in a particular cultural and historical context, sociocultural practices are always dependent upon a basic level of intentionality, impelling and sustaining sociocultural expressions at every moment. Embodied selfhood highlights our intrinsic corporeality of being in the world, which sustains and animates self-expression and which is always intertwined with a shared world. In this sense, embodied selfhood is inherently intercorporeal and thus relational. Intercorporeality captures the ways in which bodies are interconnected with one another through a pre-reflective intertwining of body schemas. It's what Merleau-Ponty describes as an intertwining of the life world through the flesh, which provides a formative and dynamic structure for human embodied existence. It's important to note that this shared corporeal existence with other beings does not diminish the significance of alterity. Indeed, intercorporeal understanding is not a perfect appropriation of others' experiences. In this sense, intercorporeality is simultaneously the foundational nature of carnal existence and the alterity and ambiguity of the possibilities that such existence affords. Given that embodied selfhood and relationality are fundamental to the human condition, it is essential that they be supported through socio-political institutions and organizational practices at the local level of citizenship. We have furnished the model of relational citizenship with a human rights ontology that recognizes these pre-reflective dimensions of agency as fundamental to being human, and thereby necessitates that we cultivate a relational environment that supports these dimensions to the fullest extent possible. In this sense, the relational model of citizenship frames the argument for actualizing the rights to this support on the basis of being human and not on the basis of individuals' formal membership in a nation state. The appeal of using human rights to furnish the ontological foundation for citizenship is that citizenship claims have purchase only in the context of a particular socio-political body. Human rights, by contrast, transcend political and/or social boundaries by virtue of their universality. Human rights are premised on fundamental principles such as universality, equality, and non-discrimination, security, and dignity. Citizenship and human rights are compatible in that citizenship allows for the local realization of human rights through socio-political institutions and organizational practices at the local level of citizenship. To this end, the model of relational citizenship is particularly pertinent for supporting the rights of persons living with dementia, because in the face of cognitive impairment, embodied self-expression becomes the primary means of engaging with the world. Such expressions are not typically valorized within traditional models of citizenship that prioritize self-sovereignty and public forms of engagement, and are consequently not publicly supported through institutional policy structures and practices. So I turn now to two research-based studies that will help me to illustrate the importance of the relational model of citizenship for understanding the creativity of persons living with dementia, while also addressing broader issues of their inclusivity and the multi-scalar support of their engagement with the arts. This will allow me to address critical links between embodiment, citizenship, relationality, and the arts. The first study was a mixed methods evaluation of a 12-week elder clown program. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this art form, since the late 1990s, clowning has been adapted for the specific use with the dementia population. Elder clowns avoid the traditional heavily made up white-faced clown with the exaggerated smile and oversized shoes. Elder clowns instead keep their faces natural with minimal makeup and wear clothing that evokes an earlier era, such as 1950s swing dresses. Elder clowns rely upon information provided by healthcare staff and family members to tailor interactions to residents' life histories, which include clinical, social, and familial details. What's also distinctively clown about elder clowns is that they don a red nose and use verbal, physical, and musical interactions that incorporate fantasy, surprise, dramatic movement, physical comedy, storytelling, and magic. They use body language ranging from subtle muscular movements of the face to more obvious gestural movements of the body. And within the context of advanced dementia, where verbal communication is often limited and maybe non-existent, clowning utilizes physically oriented question and answer tactics such as eye contact, smiling, short actions, and slower movements. The context for this study was a dementia care unit of a nursing home in urban central Canada. 4 elder clowns were hired for the study. They had been professionally trained at recognized Canadian clown organizations. 23 residents participated in the study. And in the study, the primary objective of ours was to explore techniques and strategies that the elder clowns used when interacting with the residents and what the residents brought to those interactions. To facilitate analysis, 66 hours of video recorded clown resident interactions were collected. Our interest here was to examine how the core tenets of relational citizenship, embodied selfhood and relationality, might be supported at the micro level of care practice. The focus here is on 2 interactions involving 3 elder clowns and 2 resident participants, each of which highlights the situated, embodied, and relational nature of creativity in the context of advanced dementia. Bridget was 84 years of age at the time of the study. She was born in Ireland and would express great pride about her Irish heritage. She was a homemaker who loved to entertain. Zazie and Cherry knock on the door of Bridget's room. "Come in," is heard from the room in response, yet when they enter, they find no one in the room. Zazie and Cherry look around the room, calling out in a sing-song voice, "Oh, hello, Bridget." At that very moment, Bridget walks out of the ensuite washroom, accompanied by her private carer, who's holding her hand. Bridget looks at the elder clowns, and with great surprise and delight with her attention, the elder clowns wildly wave their arms and giggle with excitement and exclaim, "Oh!" As if taken aback by their excitement, Bridget clutches her chest and grins widely. Then, in a soft but deliberate gesture, Bridget extends her right hand out in front of her body, and her arm follows in a sweeping movement out to her right side, as if presenting herself to the elder clowns. With this gesture, Bridget commences a rendition of the song, "When Irish Eyes Are Smiling." The elder clowns sway their bodies to her song and join in singing. Bridget is very expressive as she sings, using an imaginary baton, lifting her shoulders and extending her arms, closing her eyes, and using musical dynamics like crescendos and decrescendos. The elder clown's singing is perfectly matched to Bridget's tempo, as are their bodily gestures of musicality. As Bridget finishes the song, she smiles and nervously adjusts the bottom of her shirt. The elder clowns erupt in enthusiastic applause and holler, "Bravo!" Bridget smiles shyly as she looks at the elder clowns, and with reserved pride joins their applause, softly clapping her hands. Frank was 91 years of age at the time of the study. He was born in Poland and worked as a delicatessen owner his whole working life. He was highly sociable, and he particularly enjoyed singing along to music and would dance at every opportunity. Zazie and Cherry knock on the door to Frank's room. Frank, who's seated in an armchair with his 4-wheeled walker placed in front of him, says, "Come in." Both Zazie and Cherry say, "Oh," startled by Frank's quick response, but eagerly enter the room. As they enter the room, Frank is leaning forward on his chair in anticipation of their arrival. He lifts both his arms up in the air as the elder clowns approach him with an excited hello. Frank extends both his arms out towards the elder clowns, and when they reciprocate the gesture, Frank leans forward and uses the arms of the chair to stand. Once he's standing, he extends his hands out towards the elder clowns. Zazie, who's standing in front of Frank to his right, grasps his right hand with her left hand. And Cherry, who's standing in front of Frank to his left, grasps his left hand with her right hand and says, hello, hello. Frank says, hi, hi. Still holding the elder clown's hands, Frank starts bouncing their clasped hands up and down, which the elder clowns interpret as a desire to dance. Zazie immediately starts humming a made-up tune, and Cherry and Frank both join in the humming. With a huge smile on his face, Frank continues to hold the elder clown's hands, but instead of the bouncing movement, he swings their clasped hands from side to side. He also shifts his weight from left to right, slightly bending his knees as he bounces along to the a cappella music. The elder clowns follow Frank's lead, dancing from side to side. Frank then lifts their clasped hands above his head and holds them there, which signals to both Zazie and Cherry to do a lady's underarm turn, which they do simultaneously, each under one of his arms. As they do so, they both exclaim, woo! Still smiling, Frank lifts his arms again to signal for them to do another underarm turn, which they do with an even more exaggerated woo! With their hands still clasped with Frank's and doing step touches in unison, Cherry says to Frank, you are an excellent dancer, sir. Frank proudly agrees by saying, yeah, with a full smile as he continues to dance with the elder clowns. So I turn now to the second research study, which is an ethnographic study of an Orthodox Jewish long-term care home, specifically one of the units that provides care for residents living with dementia. All of the residents were Jewish of Eastern European descent, and our analysis here focuses on a series of interactions during religious, social programs in the home. Jewishness is a vital, integral part of the daily life in this home. There are 2 rabbis on staff, daily synagogue services are offered on site, a facility-wide kosher food policy is in place, and there are Sabbath and other holiday observances. The following 2 field notes capture the enactment of different ancient ritual gestures related to the holidays of Simchat Torah and Hanukkah. Each ritual involves certain symbols that pertain to the Jewish home and family, as well as customs that are enacted and are thus profoundly corporeal experiences. The major ritual associated with Hanukkah is the lighting of the menorah. The menorah is lit each night of Hanukkah after sundown with the shamash, which is the candle that's used for lighting other candles, which is placed higher on the menorah to differentiate it from the others. 1 candle is added each night until all candles are lit on the last night of Hanukkah. The last day of Hanukkah is considered to have special significance as the culmination of the holiday, the day when the menorah burns most brightly. It is on the 8th and final day of this religious occasion that a concert and party are arranged for the residents in the recreation room. A ceremonial lighting of the menorah is part of this celebration. The following observation is of Dora during the Hanukkah celebration that powerfully captures her love of dance, requiring neither a partner nor even to stand from her wheelchair. The concert began with piano and a strong alto voice filling the room with Yiddish song. As I stood listening and watching, I noticed Dora. Somehow, sitting in her wheelchair, Dora was dancing. She created a sense of fluidity and abandon with the elegant movement of her arms above her head and the delicate wiggling of her fingers while slowly lowering her hands to each side of her wheelchair. Dramatically tossing her head back, she extended her arms above her head in the style of an arabesque. So choreographed was her dance that I wondered if she was reenacting a performance from another time. When the song finished, applause erupted in appreciation for the singer and pianist, and Dora moved her upper body forward in her chair as if to take a bow for her own performance. Jelly donuts brought out by the staff and volunteers were served to the residents on plastic plates with a napkin. Dora ate her donut as she continued to listen to the music. With her hands busy with the donut, she struggled to stretch her legs out in front of her. Her swollen feet looked almost delicate as she gently brought her toes together and then her heels together, alternating these movements to the rhythm of the music. The second example I'd like to share is Simchat Torah, which is one of the most widely celebrated rituals of the Jewish faith. It's the day of celebration for the gift of Torah, the 5 books of Moses. The following observation illustrates the enactment of an ancient ritual gesture related to this holiday of Simchat Torah. On Simchat Torah, the synagogue at the facility rang out powerfully in hymn. My attention was drawn to the center of the synagogue where the men prayed with intensity and passion. Among the participants stood Jacob. Jacob would often chastise residents who, because of their dementia, were disruptive. Ironically, his own advanced dementia had limited his verbal expression to the use of single words. Yet Jacob moved his lips with the service leader's chants. I watched as he swayed deeply, stepping forward and back, bowing and striking his chest with clenched fists, as is commonly done in Jewish prayer. He was energetic and forceful in his fervent bodily movement of prayer. The leader held a Torah scroll and circled the interior of the synagogue, followed by honored members of the congregation who held the other scrolls. After the procession of Torah bearers circled the synagogue, the leader broke out in joyous song, and all the congregation joined in singing and dancing. In the center of the synagogue, the men formed a circle and danced around those who held a Torah scroll. Jacob joined in the pounding dances. He threw his body completely into rejoicing with the Torah, twisting his shoulders and hips and snapping his fingers in the air. The relational model of citizenship importantly broadens understandings of creativity by foregrounding how capacities and senses of the body are central to creativity in everyday life for persons living with dementia. It specifically holds that embodied intentionality, which is itself inherently pre-reflective and relational, is a generative and creative capacity to perceive and engage with the world. The pre-reflective nature of embodied intentionality refers to existential or practical competence and does not require reflective understanding. To illustrate that embodied intentionality is key to understanding creativity in the context of dementia, I draw here on the key theoretical tenets of the relational model of citizenship: embodied selfhood, specifically the primordial and sociocultural dispositions of the body that are sources of self-expression, and relationality. I begin by attending to the sociocultural style or content of Frank's and Bridget's creativity, given how embodiment and the sociocultural are co-implicated. Take, for example, how Frank seamlessly led the elder clowns into a lady's underarm turn, what is typical of the European style of social partner dancing. Thinking of this dance in terms of Barbara Meyerhoff's analysis of ritual practice is instructive, as it helps us to see how the past returns with the ritual movements, gestures, and recapitulations, all evoked through the senses, linking the individual to associations and feelings of previous times. For Frank, partner dancing is the active presence of his past, what Bourdieu would describe as embodied history, internalized as a second nature, and so forgotten as history. It was the presence of the elder clowns, their formal and party dress attire, the touch of their clasped hands, and the sounds of humming, which were all aspects of an interaction that exercised the pertinent incitement of Frank's sociocultural dispositions, which are a fundamental source of his embodied intentionality and hence his creativity. We can similarly see with Bridget's spontaneous musical rendition of When Irish Eyes Are Smiling, that the presence of the elder clowns and their attire incited her sociocultural dispositions associated with her Irish heritage and her practice of socializing and entertaining guests. Her chosen song is a culturally distinct style of music, often formally or spontaneously performed without musical accompaniment, and thus is consistent with what would have been socially and culturally distinct experiences of hers. As with Frank, Bridget's socially and culturally distinct dimensions of musicality are manifest despite her impaired cognition because of how sociocultural dispositions are regulated not by conscious obeisance to external rules, but by the pre-reflective nature of embodied intentionality. Jacob's performance similarly illustrates how embodiment and enculturation are co-implicated. The emotion that's commonly expressed by Eastern European Jews in gesture and speech is similarly expressed in prayer through dance and bodily movement. In Jewish faith, gestures and movements are essential ingredients in the life of prayer, enabling the worshipers to put their whole of themselves into the act of worship. On Simchat Torah, as Jacob prayed and swayed deeply, stepping forward and back, bowing and striking his chest with clenched fists, a kind of dance reflecting an intense and vital bodily force that's common in Jewish prayer. Thus, Jewish heritage was fundamentally influential in that ritual aroused deep memories, those surges of remembrance that are not merely accurate and extensive, but bring with them the essences and textures of their original context, transcending time and even dementia. Reenacting rituals that were part of one's early childhood is not a matter of delving into the past through a cognitive operation. Rituals carry a potent emotion and cultural rootedness that is embodied. The presence of the rabbi and congregants, the touch of the Torah, the scent of burning candles, and the sanctuary all offered a dynamic field of sensual mutuality that intersected with Jacob's embodied selfhood, thereby eliciting the dispositions necessary for his expression through dance. We can see that with Dora too, her dance was connected with a ritual of the Jewish faith, one that carries with it a joyous sentiment that was reflected in her fluidity and abandon, with the movements of her arms, the wiggling of her fingers, and the playfulness in how she brought together her toes and then her heels in an alternating pattern. There was a congruence between her movements and the celebratory nature of the occasion. We can say that it is embodied selfhood that harmonized her dance, in that her knowledge of the movements was pre-reflective and activated only when evoked in practice. To be even more precise, it is a practical reactivation whereby the knowledge that the body reproduces is not a memorization of the past, but rather an enactment of the past. In this sense, Dora's dance discloses a kind of mastery in the form of transposable dispositions that collectively function as a matrix of perceptions and actions, which are acquired as part of primary learning and reinforced through socialization within a Jewish home, and implemented only by way of immersion within a practical state. Yet the sociocultural dispositions evident in Frank's, Bridget's, Jacob's, and Dora's expressions of creativity are but half the picture, since the primordial structure of the body not only facilitates the embodiment of sociocultural dispositions, but also sustains them on an ongoing basis. In this sense, while Frank's and Bridget's creativity is shaped by their specific sociocultural history, it is also sustained by the primordial structure of bodies themselves, which supports both the initial internalization of the structural principles of the social world that underlie such dispositions, as well as all of their subsequent manifestations. The primordial refers to a fundamental attunement of the body to the world, which is a kind of knowing that derives from the body's natural investment with perceptual significance, a bodily know-how or practical sense. This form of know-how functions below the threshold of cognition and is enacted as practical sense at a pre-reflective level. In this rethinking of perception, gestures and actions are not related to intention by way of being a representation of them that's externally linked, but rather intention is immanent in the gestures and actions themselves, impelling and sustaining them at every moment. In this sense, creativity is the existential expressiveness of the body that emerges from our active and responsive propensity towards the world. Because dominant narratives of creativity are premised on cognition, there is a seeming contradiction between Frank's, Bridget's, Jacob's, and Dora's creativity and the fact of their cognitive impairment. Yet, as we've argued, the relational model of citizenship introduces a pre-reflective account of embodied intentionality that offers a compelling alternative to dominant understandings of creativity in the context of dementia. Frank's and Bridget's performances were not an intellectual effort of meditation and contemplation, nor did they derive from rules, principles, or calculations, or a premeditated goal, which would in any case be excluded by the improvisational nature of their performances. And in both cases, reflective thought and calculation would be further excluded by the fact of their advanced dementia. Neither could their movements be mistaken for pure imitation, particularly if we consider that in all four examples, the participants led aspects of their creative self-expression. Now, importantly, it was a corporeal ethical space that supported Frank's and Bridget's spontaneous and creative engagement within the context of their everyday life in long-term care. Jacob's and Dora's creativity can similarly be seen to have emerged from a corporeal ethical space. A religious holiday with corresponding rituals orchestrated at the home created a meaningful connection with their selfhood, a connection that triggered their specific actions. For Jacob, the synagogue, its congregants, the presence of the rabbi, and the touch of the Torah scrolls were aspects of an organized event that exercised the pertinent incitement of his habitus. And for Dora, it was the menorah, the piano and Yiddish song, and the residents' holiday attire that supported her performance. The resulting creativity in all of these examples can only be understood with reference to the complex intersection of enabling environments and the embodied intentionality of all involved. In this way, our analysis importantly offers a theoretical articulation of co-creativity, which has been used to only descriptively capture the embodied and relational nature of creativity. Our analysis also importantly responds to a call for the development of a broader view of creativity to account for the everyday and ordinary creativity of regular citizens, including persons living with dementia. The importance of broadening conventional narratives of creativity in this way is that it provides a more inclusive view of creative practice that might not have an enduring legacy, but are nonetheless meaningful in the context of everyday lives. The implication of our analysis is that the body as a source of agency is not only fundamental to creativity, but also must be recognized as fundamental to the human condition. As such, it's imperative that all forms of creativity be supported through a matrix of human rights, such as freedoms of expression and human dignity, and that it be supported through organizational practices and socio-political institutions. This entails the mobilization of structures and resources to nurture and facilitate the creativity of persons living with dementia for life enrichment, rather than as a form of maintenance entertainment with the aim to keep people happy and offering little creative challenge. For example, despite that people living with dementia can engage in unstructured painting and develop new skills, painting is often restricted to paint by number. And as we've argued elsewhere, this fails to fully support the creativity of persons living with dementia. Elder clowns are particularly well positioned to support and nurture creativity, unlike structured arts-based programs often delivered by non-artists, elder clowns are professional artists who have a distinct cultural and aesthetic competence. More specifically, they recognize and nurture the embodied intentionality of persons living with dementia, so that creativity can synchronously emerge from organic, spontaneous co-constructions. Yet it is our contention that creativity should not be confined to arts-based programs, but rather should be nurtured in all aspects of everyday life. This will also require shifting the culture of dementia care by fostering the relational skills and creative practices of all care providers, so that creativity becomes part of the moral fabric of everyday life in long-term residential care settings. Finally, practice development of this nature needs to happen in tandem with broader structural changes that more fully support the relational, interpersonal, and affective dimensions of care. These include, but are not limited to, reducing providers' workloads and increasing provider to resident ratios, increasing their decision-making autonomy to allow them to more fully support residents' needs, capacities, and desires. So in conclusion, with the relational model of citizenship, we've argued that in the context of dementia, rather than seeing creativity as a cognitive trait, it should be understood as emerging from the complex intersection of enabling environments and embodied intentionality of all involved. This not only adds a new dimension to understanding creativity, but in a more profound sense, sets an important ethical standard for cultivating relational environments to support creativity in everyday life in long-term care settings. So I will finish there. And I thank you all for your comments and, for your attention, and I welcome your comments and questions. Thank you.